Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Laura Williams, and as a board trustee for North Carolina Humanities, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's virtual book event. Let's give everyone another minute or so to join. And in the meantime, we welcome you to share where you're joining from this evening in the chat. With many other choices on how to spend your time, I thank you personally for choosing this event and for joining us at the first virtual book event in a series for North Carolina Reads, our statewide book club for 2023. North Carolina Reads features 5 books that explore issues of racial, social, and gender equality and the history and culture of North Carolina. As a statewide nonprofit and as North Carolina's affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated panel discussion on Carolina Built, the first book in our 2023 North Carolina Reads series. Please note any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of North Carolina Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my pleasure to welcome my fellow North Carolina Humanities Board Trustee, Liliana Wendorf, as this evening's moderator. Liliana is a professor emerita from the Languages Department at Queen's University, right here in Charlotte. We also would like to welcome Kiana Alexander, the author, and Dr. Hillary Green as our panelists. I'll now turn it over to Melissa Giblin, North Carolina Humanities Center for the Book Director, to finish housekeeping instructions for this evening.
Thank you, Laura. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and how you can engage with us during this event. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel at NC Humanities and like our videos. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab or through the chat. We will have a designated time towards the end of the program for audience questions for our panelists, and we will send reminders through the chat to submit your questions. Closed caption is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to share your experience on social media by tagging @NC Humanities on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. It is my pleasure to turn the event over to Liliana to formally introduce our panelists.
Okay. Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome, everybody. It is a pleasure to be moderating this wonderful book, Carolina Built, by Kiana Alexander. So let me tell you a little bit about our 2 panelists here. Kiana Alexander wears many hats: doting mama, advice dispensing sister, fun aunt, and gavin girlfriend. Since her first publication in 2009, Kiana has gone on to publish more than 40 books and has been interviewed for national and international publications. In her spare time, she's a voracious reader, a hobbyist seamstress and crafter. Kiana is proud to tell stories where Black women are loved, valued, and thriving, and she truly believes in the power of fiction to build empathy and enrich the inner life. Born and raised in Durham, Kiana still lives in North Carolina, where she is raising 2 young changemakers and juggling home and career. Now, Dr. Hillary Green is the James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. Her research and teaching interests include the intersections of race, class, and gender in African American history, the American Civil War and Reconstruction eras, Civil War memory, the U.S. South, and the Black Atlantic. She is the author of Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890, and is currently writing a 2nd book manuscript exploring how everyday African Americans remembered and commemorated the Civil War from 1863 to the present. Okay. So now I'm going to start with the questions. The first one is to Kiana. Kiana, what led you to the topic of Josephine N. Lurie?
Buddy,
Uh-huh.
thank you so much for coming out. Even though I've lived in North Carolina most of my life, I was not aware of Josephine Leary until just a few years ago in 2019,
Mhm.
when I encountered a tweet by Sarah Younger, a literary agent who is also a North Carolina native, but agents out of New York now. I just happened to see that tweet on my feed as I have been following Sarah for a little while, mentioning Mrs. Leary. She was visiting Edenton at the time because she's from around that area. And she was visiting the historical society there, saw the placards and markers and things referring to Mrs. Leary, and went on Twitter saying that she wanted someone to write a book about it. Who will write this book for me? And when I saw the tweet, I volunteered because I was interested to know more about Mrs. Leary, having never encountered her story before, seeing that she was a Black woman and someone from North Carolina really just excited my interest and sort of activated my history nerd.
Very good. Now, this question is for Hillary. Hillary, what is the largest historical context for the time, 1870s to 1890s, in which the story is set?
I will say that I love this book because it is so Northeast North Carolina. It is the set of emancipation. It's the set of African Americans claiming freedom for themselves and creating new lives that were not tied to slavery. And that meant everything that they had under slavery in terms of hard work and labor and a task system and abuses, they would not have for themselves, but more importantly, their children. So it's that period is more about adults who survived slavery and defining new futures for their children, whether it's through education, whether it's through owning land, whether it's about creating where they didn't have to do the work that they had. And that's something I really appreciated about this book in the context, because it really gets what's going on in Pasquotank, Perquimans, in Chowan County. As someone who taught at Elizabeth City State University, there's a reason why that school exists there, because of women like Josephine Leary. They created new lives for themselves in the future, and they did everything possible in an area that does not always get looked at. They turned to education, they turned to land ownership, they turned to other businesses because they thought about not just themselves, but their families, their communities, and what lives would they have in the future.
Mhm. That's precisely what impresses me about this novel is Josephine Leary, getting ahead in all areas with her family, and then acquisition of properties in a very difficult area for African Americans, no, and for women in particular, no. Okay, so the next question to Kiana. Kiana, Josephine is surrounded by female figures throughout the story. What do her relationships with Grandma Millie, Jeanette, Clara, and Flory show about family dynamics and ideas about mothering?
So the information that I was able to find about Mrs. Leary's life, which mostly came from her papers that are kept at Duke University at the Rubenstein, and from actually visiting Edenton, show a sort of deep connection between her and all of the members of her family. But I think that especially existed between her grandmother and her mother, and even with her sister-in-law, Missouri, because there is some sort of special kinship that has always existed between women and femme-identifying people when it comes to sort of adapting to and carrying out the roles that are involved in caregiving, and running a household, domestic tasks, and sort of the care and keeping of even things like the church, the neighborhood. It's us that are, running the bake sales and organizing activities for the children to participate in, monitoring the children to make sure they're safe. There are all these different things that women and femme-identifying people participate in together as a unit in order to provide the caregiving that sort of provides foundational safety and stability for entire communities. And women sort of relate to each other on that level. And I think that is part of what kept them so closely together. Many times throughout Josephine's life, when the census would be taken and stuff, they would find that the 3 generations of women, and then after Clara and Flory came along, 4 generations of women of that family were all living in the same household. And with it being such a time of things being very tumultuous and unsettled for Black people, just gaining freedom, trying to gain their footing financially, sticking together as a family unit would have not just emotional benefits, but also financial benefits for them to be able to make sure that everybody in the family was taken care of and had a safe place to live. And I think that was really something pivotal to Josephine's life, the way she approached things. She had the support that when she needed to go look at a property, when she needed to stay late at the barbershop to do inventory, she knew that there was someone around who could look after her children and maybe take care of some things around the house if she couldn't do them. And so I think that in a way enabled her the way that the work of women and feminine identifying people today enables men to go about their business. There was something of a similar thing happening there, that she knew that someone was there for her, someone had her back, that she would be able to take out the things that she needed to take care of, and things around her house would be looked after in her absence.
Muy bien. Hillary, is there anything you would like to add about the relationship between among all these women about mothering?
One of the things I really like, it's the extension of what comes out of slavery. These networks that would have been there in the slave community, these networks of women who would have taken care of younger children while the mothers were out in the fields, those who were there, and those ties. And one of the things I really liked about this book to really emphasize is the parental advice that Josephine has from her mother. That is such a natural thing that happened both past and present. But having this multi-generational household of women and women's networks, those were so essential for surviving, but those were so essential for Josephine to survive slavery itself, that just carried on into freedom. Those ties and communities didn't break, even though emancipation came in 1865.
Okay. Yeah. Now, after Josephine begins her life as a free woman, she marries Archer Sweetie Leary. Josephine then begins to build her legacy through the purchase of pieces of real estate, including the barbershop business she runs with Sweetie. What is significant about Josephine's accomplishments in building a real estate empire?
So during this time period, especially, it was unheard of for women in general to own property. And that was especially even truer for Black women who were just even gaining freedom and trying to gain their footing just as regular citizens and free people. So this was like a particularly ostentatious goal for her to take on. This was something that was, most people would look at her and say, this is too big for your britches. This is beyond you, above you. But it was something that she felt was important for her to do, something that sort of fascinated her. I think my conjecture is that after so long of being property herself, it meant something to her to be able to say that she owned something. And I think that she also possessed a lot of vision in that she could look at a piece of land or look at a building that may not be in the best possible shape right now. She could look beyond what it was at the time to what it could possibly be. And she was able to make wise investments based on her own sort of vision and savvy. And there was also a certain level of organization that had to go into making sure that she knew when and where to be so that she could attend these auctions, she could view properties, she could get in contact with inspectors and things like that to make sure that everything was working the way she planned. And there also had to be organization in that she was able to separate her barbering business that she shared with her husband from the real estate business, because they were two separate businesses. So all the accounting and the record keeping that goes along with that was also something that she managed all on her own. So I think it shows a lot of intelligence, a lot of capability, and just someone who was remarkably driven to create something that would be lasting and that she could then pass on to her children.
I see. Okay. So, Hillary, So following this question for you also, what do you think is significant about Josephine's accomplishments in building a real estate empire during that very difficult time for African Americans and also for women?
One, she is so savvy. She's a businesswoman. She is so, I like the understanding of being property to own property. And I read that in the novel as well. There's something about that recognition, but also to her training before she opens up the business and the mention of that she was an educator first and what she would have learned. She had those skills. She could recognize that, but one of those drives that she said, my children will not be this. This is my separate. So she could compartmentalize in a way that when we talk about Black women this time, we talk about them giving money to the Freedmen's Savings Banks. We talk about Black women and creating schools and organizations, but we never talk about Black women as landowners. So for her as a landowner, creating this empire separate from her husband, she is brave, intelligent, capable, but yet thinking about the mission of what is coming out, a mother's love. And I think that's what makes her, unites her, but her property ownership and her empire that she builds, I think is something that we need to know more about. And the fact that some of her property still lasts today, that this isn't something that was fleeting. She built something to last. She built intergenerationally. And I think it shows something about the drive of her coming out of slavery and then being a washerwoman and what she would and would not have for her children going forward. And what kind of relationship she will have with her husband and what kind of businesses she wanted to make sure that nothing that she controlled would jeopardize her children and family's future. And I think that's something about her, that she is brave, but also too a savvy businesswoman that we need to know more about because she was so rare. She is one of the exceptions, but I know there was others. So who are the other Josephine Learys that we have not learned about? How did she use her initials to be able to go about buying property as a Black woman in what was seen as a man's world? Her going to auctions, that's a boldness, that's a business savviness that we need to look at as what she is. She is the CEO of this corporation. And it's not Madam C.J. Walker that we need to go to. We can go to Josephine Leary earlier.
So maybe, Kiana, you can look into that with other women that acquire a lot of properties.
I've definitely already started looking into other stories like this that have gone untold, not necessarily related to real estate, but there are other stories even in her own family that are quite remarkable that I'm looking at now and doing research on.
Yeah, I like the part where when her property burns down, and then she takes her time thinking about what she wants to do with it. Does she sell it or does she build? And I think that is the building that is at the end of the book, right? That has become a historical building. Yes, now I want to go to Edenton. I have never been there, but I would like to go just to see the building now.
It's in really good shape.
It really is. And someone who's been there, it's beautiful. Go see it.
Definitely. This summer, I will do that. Okay. Kiana, Josephine presents at the Edenton's Ladies Auxiliary meeting about societal roles of the modern woman, with an emphasis on financial independence. What does this scene show about social expectations for women during the 1880s, and how does this compare to today?
So one of the things that Josephine was very much aware of was that the main way in which men and society at large have control over women is through financial domination, and that if a woman doesn't have her own finance, her own money to be able to live, to afford to take care of herself, then that leaves her pretty much under the thumb of any man nearby who has the means to take care of her. So that was something that she was very much aware of, and she was trying to point out. And when we look at societal expectations of that time as to what women's lives were supposed to be about, the going thought was that women belonged in the house. They were to be involved with child rearing and domestic duties, and those two things were supposed to fulfill all of their needs and desires. They were to go about these tasks, with happiness and, joy all the time. It was about deference to men, about purity, virginity, quietness and meekness, outer beauty, dressing modestly, not wearing pants, and not doing anything that might make you in any way competitive to or in opposition to a man, was typically the way that women were expected to carry out their entire lives. And that was sort of a box drawn around a woman's feet during her life. And if she ever was to step over one of those lines outside of the box, it was going to lead to some consequences, some negative consequences for her life. Those consequences could then have fallout for her children, and make things difficult for everyone involved. And so it was a very precarious situation that women were in that they were oftentimes by society and by financial necessity beholden to the demands of men. And so that was something that was important for her to point out to them, because she was very much aware of this. It can sort of call back to a different sort of bondage than what slavery was, but it's not as intense, but it definitely has its ways of keeping a hold on women and keeping them in their place, so to speak. And I think in many ways, a lot of that carries over today. If you see the discourse that happens on social media, with these young men who have podcasts now and want to scream into the microphone every week about what they think women ought to be doing and how they're not going to settle for women who aren't doing all the things they think they ought to be doing. You can see the echoes of that very same attitude, that women are to be in deference to men, never in competition to men, act and speak and carry themselves a certain way to satisfy the male gaze, still echoing today. So it very much lingers. And I think it becomes a little more insidious because it flies under the radar. It's not as overt all the time as it was back then, but it's definitely still there. And it sort of creeps into media, and it creeps into the ways in which men and women engage with each other. So it always kind of fascinates me how this attitude has lingered so long, with so many things having changed, technology, education, science, all these things that we know now that we didn't know in Josephine's time. Knowing all those things, why are we still clinging to these same antiquated beliefs about what women should and shouldn't be doing?
Yeah. Hilary, do you agree that the social expectations during the Josephine Leary time are the same as today's?
Yeah, there are definitely some echoes. And one of the things I see is once slavery is no more, there's an expectation that Black men will be men and Black women will fit into these white Victorian norms. And that's something that lingers on, and you can see in the novel how Josephine pushes back, especially when Sweetie tries to confront her to be a homemaker. And she's like, we've talked about this. And she's not just this meek wife. She refuses to be put in that box. And I think we see that today in podcasts, Twitter, social media, these lingering expectations of what the ideal woman is that gets mapped on to women who were never seen as ideal under slavery or in the 19th century or the 20th century. But that's still the myth that we have in American culture. So when those frictions happen, when those things don't intersect, how do we have the interior lives of a marriage and those interior conversations that we're not always privy to? We're only privy to the ones who are the loudest on the podcast, the ones online who are speaking. And that's something I liked about this novel. She really gets us into the interior, that these conversations aren't new. They were happening. So how do you then bring this in a novel, because we don't have that kind of documentation? So this is where I think the license of a novel, I was like, yes, I took note of her refusal. And that
Yes.
refusal means something because we still have Black women today refusing to fit into the box of what society and those who buy into society norms are there.
Yeah, these women are very feminist, particularly Josephine. No, Sweetie has all this pressure from his clients or friends about not being the man in the house. That's bugging him. Yeah, but she was just amazing, amazing. Yeah, for her time. Yeah. Okay. So, Kiana, can you discuss Josephine's friendship with Rosa? How does their decades-long friendship contrast to the experiences of racism and injustice that Sweetie and Josephine experience throughout the novel? Let's start with that, okay?
Yeah, so Rosa is one of the few characters that was fictional. A lot of the people who populate Josephine's world were real people, even down to the cabinet maker, Mr. Ziegler, who made the cabinets and the caskets for the town, Mr. Newman, who ran the general store. Those are real people. I found their names through ads in newspapers at the time. So I know that they were real and that was the business they were in. I just gave them personalities. Rosa was completely out of my imagination. Rosa is an idealistic character. She is meant to represent the ideal counterpart for Josephine, someone who was able to sort of rise above all the things that were standing between them in terms of their differences and societal expectations of how they should treat one another, such that, Rosa should be, someone who would speak down to Josephine, and Josephine should defer to her and perhaps not look her in the eye or look at the ground when she spoke to her because of the differences in their race and their station in life. And I wanted to give space for a person who could rise above all of that, because I saw Josephine as a person who could rise above all of that. So this was her ideal counterpart, someone who could meet her where she was, to subvert everything around them, telling them why they should not be friends. And the depth and breadth of the relationship that they had was to represent sort of a reward. Like, this is what you can attain. This is what you can have in terms of a relationship with another person. If you can get past all this petty foolishness that's meant to divide us, separate us, keep us apart, then you can have these sorts of deep friendships that affect your life, both lives, in such a positive way, where there's equal give and take, where there is that resting place from a harsh world that you can find in that other person. If you can rise above these things, if you can be a person who can see a person for who they are and not what society tells you they're supposed to be, these are the kinds of relationships that you can have. So I think that was the reason that Rosa was such a important character for me to add to the story, because we need that. We need that perspective to be able to, okay, I'm not going to just, I'm not going to set this person aside. I'm not going to discount their humanity because they don't look like me. They're not the same religion as me. They're not the same sexuality or gender as me. We need to get past those things. Look at the person for who they are on the inside and stop judging based on all of these silly outside factors, and really rise above that and meet them in this wonderful, full friendship.
Yeah. Okay. Hilary, can you also discuss Josephine's friendship with Rosa and how their decades-long friendship contrasts to the experiences of racism and injustice that Sweetie and Josephine experience throughout the novel?
One of the things I'm not going to echo too much because I think Kiana captured it. You need friendships. You need these female friendships to keep you real, to keep you grounded. And the fact that she's the ideal person matters, because there's some gaps in Josephine Leary's life that we don't really have. So how do you feel who's the people who sustained her, who nourished her, who gave her those lifelong friendships that were there, but was able to get around the racism at the time and the period at the time, and the holes and the silences, the archives that we just don't know. And that's where I think Rosa is so important, because she had to have that community. And that's something we see in the time period, those lifelong friendships that start out so long, they're dying together, 40 years, 50 years friends. Who was that for Josephine in her everyday dealings? Who's the one who empowered her? Was it a classmate? Was it not just her family, but who in the community? And Rosa fits that perfect foil to help understand in layers of new things that we just don't know from the archives of who Josephine is. But I know she had female friends and that female networks, and I think this is one of the powers of this book. It's the female networks that carry this. Josephine is not acting by herself.
Yeah.
She's a mother, she's a daughter, she's tied to so many. It's those relationships among Black women that are so important. And that's why I love that lifelong friendship in the novel with Rosa.
Yes.
What's that self-care look like? Who's she laughing with? Who's she crying with?
Yeah.
That's how Rosa fits into this narrative. I think is really powerful.
Yeah. Okay. So, Kiana, how do the scenes of racism and injustice use literary devices, allegory specifically, to speak to African American experiences during this time?
So I know that there have been a lot of works written about this sort of time period. This is like Gilded Age, Reconstruction, going into Redemption, sort of the incubator of Jim Crow laws that were soon to come behind this time period. And, you know, it's not just books, there are other media, films, television shows that have explored this. I think of 12 Years a Slave, Underground, all these different types of media that have explored this time period and have done so in a way that is very hard hitting, very in your face, a lot of times very graphic and can be upsetting. So my approach to this book, leaving aside all those things, knowing that they were true, they did happen to us as Black people. And I actually had someone ask me, you know, why didn't you talk about, you know, the Wilmington race riots and things like that? The time period that the story ends is right around 1894, and the race riot didn't happen until 1898. So it's simply beyond the scope of this particular story in terms of the timeline. But there were all sorts of terrible, violent things happening to Black people during this time period and right there around Josephine and her family. Now, I took a certain approach as an author in portraying these sorts of events in the story with my reader in mind. I knew that there would be a lot of readers who looked like me, who looked like Josephine, who are carrying this ancestral trauma from all the violence that we faced during and after slavery, the violence that we still face today at the hands of police, etc. There's a way to portray these things so that everyone understands what's happening without traumatizing and triggering my sisters and brothers who are going to read this book. And that was my main goal, that I would be able to portray the hardships that Josephine would face in terms of sexism and racism without triggering and traumatizing my reader, who would, you know, be African-American and be familiar with these things, and they would know what it meant. So if you look at her interactions with white women, such as being at the conference in Rocky Mount and being at the auction, there was a lot of disrespectful talk given to Josephine by those white women, which was common for interactions between white women and Black women. There wasn't generally going to be too much in the way of like fisticuffs and physical altercation between women, but they would definitely speak nastily to her because that was something that was approachable, that was easy for them to do. It didn't in any way inconvenience them, it didn't mess up their clothes, but it gave them enough power to sort of, it was a way for them to tear Josephine down. It was very easy to do verbally without them getting physically involved. So this would have been something that was a common occurrence in her life, being spoken nastily to and spoken down to by white women. And so that was something that I portrayed more than once, because that would have probably been the most common occurrence. She would have mostly been around women. She would have seen this sort of thing more than anything else. Now, when we look at violence, physical violence, I chose to take that allegorically. If you remember the scene of the Juneteenth picnic at the church, where everybody is in the churchyard, Josephine's entire family is there, Octavius and Missouri, and there was this thing about Missouri having this brand new, this brand new blouse that she was very proud that she had just gotten. It was so, white and pretty and everything. And, those racist whites come through and they are spoiling the party by racing through the churchyard on that wagon, and they are pelting them with rotten tomatoes. Now, when you look at that on the surface, you're like, oh, it's a prank. It's not that big of a deal. But let's look at it the way that I meant it, as an allegory for violence carried out by white people on Black bodies. If you think about tomato as a fruit and what it looks like, it's a red fruit. When it begins to rot, the flesh darkens, becomes lumpy, thick, sticky, oozy. It takes on the qualities that one might find similar to blood, brain matter, and all the stuff that comes out of a body when it's hit by a bullet, when it is struck by a blunt object, all of those sorts of things. So that rotten tomato flesh was meant to represent the broken bodies of Black people without specifically saying so on the page. And when you look at that scene and you see the aftermath of Missouri being so frightened and she's crying, and now this new outfit that she was so proud of just a few moments before is ruined. It represents something. It represents that what happens after the beatings, after the shootings, the people laying in the street with the blood on their clothing. This is how you see Missouri and everybody attending, covered in this red viscous material. That's what I meant to portray without upsetting people. Black people reading this would know immediately what I meant by that, without me having to say they rode through the clubs and beat everybody half to death. We understand what it is. So there's a way to go about it to take a lighter touch that calls this up without traumatizing or triggering the reader. And so that was very important to me, because we as Black people know the sorts of things we've been through. We carry that with us every day. It is inside of us. It isn't something that we can ever escape or have a break from. So there was no need for me to dramatize it or make it any more brutal than it had to be in order to point out what was happening. And so that was the approach that I took in writing this story. I wanted to do it from a place of caring, just as I did it from a place of love, respect, and admiration for Mrs. Leary. I also did it from a place of love, respect, and caring for my reader.
Very good. Okay, Hilary, can you talk about how the scenes of racism speak to the African-American experiences during the time of Josephine Leary?
That's one of the things I liked about it, the everyday violences between white and Black women. I have read countless accounts of white women being upset over seeing a Black woman with a ribbon in her hair. Just the audacity to dress not in slave clothing, to have and to buy those small things of fabric and care, and to make better clothing what they had in slavery. And that starts in 1865, in the weeks after emancipation. So for her, one of my favorite scenes, and I just was like, yes, thank you, was when she goes against the early Ladies Memorial Associations to build a Confederate memorial home, because those are the other women who are at those auctions. They are buying property to preserve and buy homes for Confederate veterans and honoring the white lost cause dead. So the fact that scene, and the white woman's like, well, what about this? And the auctioneer's like, well, you just got outbid. That interaction, I know, was more realistic based on what other white women are doing in Northeast North Carolina or doing elsewhere. And the fact that her dollar amount was able to counter that interaction. But the slight, as a Black woman, that she can buy this property, she could outbid the community wealth of white women who pulled their money together. She had her money independently. She didn't need the collective to do this. Says something about her purchasing power. But I love the fact that you didn't talk about the lynchings that happened in this time period, the violences. Reconstruction's not talked about because it's one of the most violent periods in American history. People, before the Klan exists, I have read accounts in Northeast North Carolina and Eastern North Carolina of Black men returning in uniform, getting shot at and made disabled, having to live in orphan asylums because they came home in a uniform. that everyday violences that were there, that even when we talk about Black respectability politics, and I have to remind my students, Black women are claiming respectability because white Americans won't treat their bodies or personhood with respect. By claiming respectability, that is their politics to say, you must respect me. And that's what I see with Josephine Leary and what she's doing. So I did not need to see the violence of a lynching. I did not need to see the beatings. And I understood when I saw the tomatoes, I was like, thank you. Because I know where you're going without having to talk about and narrating what those events in the aftermath would have looked like. And I've read those accounts and those everyday violences that did not spare men, women, children, or the elderly. It was the fact that they were gathering in a space of joy. That's what provoked white violence. So I understood that. And I love that because it's the verbal, it's the navigation of the space was already a violent encounter. And then you had this. So we didn't need to go into the actual description of what that looked like. And I greatly appreciate that because it's not only triggering, one of the things I think why we don't talk about Leary, why we don't talk about Black success, is because this period was so violent, everyone wants to say, what was happy and joyous about this? They did this in spite of. Leary did this in spite of the violences. So let's talk about survival, resilience, joy, and what happens when you can't ignore that or when you can. And that's one of the things I appreciated about the violence and racism that on the page. It's blatant in some things if you know the material, but other areas, the allegory and the metaphor matters more because you can then talk about it in a different way without shutting down people when they have to talk about what that actually looks like in reality.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, one last question, and I'm going to start with Kiana. Kiana, is there anything that you are working on currently that you would like to share with the audience?
Yes, so I'm just in the sort of early stages of this, but as I said earlier, there are more remarkable stories like this that have gone untold. There are a lot of them still to be told for North Carolinians. One of them being Hiram Rhodes Revels, who was a native of Fayetteville, who went on to become the first Black man to serve in the Senate, and he took the seat in 1870. That was previously occupied by Jefferson Davis, who vacated that seat to become president of the Confederacy at the beginning of the Civil War. And there's a direct line of connection between Mr. Revels and Hakeem Jeffries, having just taken that historic place as the first ever Black man to serve as the House Minority Leader. So that is one story that I'm looking at, doing early research on. Also, looking at Mrs. Leary's own family. We know that her last living linear relative was a Dr. Maureen Pelham Johnson, who was born in the early 1900s in Washington, D.C. She would have been the granddaughter of Octavius and Missouri. And she lived her entire life, for the most part, in Washington, D.C. She did become a physician. She went to historic Dunbar High School, where she graduated in 1931. She was a graduate of Howard University and also a graduate of their medical school in 1939. She was a physician mostly focused on the care of patients with contagious diseases such as tuberculosis. She received a Rockefeller Fellowship to do research on tuberculosis. In the 1960s, she would become chief of staff for outpatient services at the VA Administration Hospital in Washington, D.C. It was the highest rank ever achieved there by a Black woman or a Black physician. Then she would go on to be chief of staff for the entire VA hospital in the 1970s, and also be a faculty member at the Howard University Medical School. And she would continue doing all these remarkable things until her retirement in 1980, at which she spent the last 20 years of her life until her death in December of 2000, volunteering and working for DAV, the Disabled American Veterans Society in DC. She was very passionate about the care of patients with communicable diseases and stopping the spread of those infections to other people. And also especially had a heart for veterans. That is the career that she maintained for most of her life. And seeing that she lived through the entirety, basically, of the 21st century, I find it remarkable that there was very little written about Dr. Johnson. And so that may well be my next project. Her connection to Mrs. Leary cannot be left aside. And as a writer, my curiosity about her was immediately sparked when I saw her name. And I've done some digging to find images of her so that I can begin looking at her story. And this is actually a profile written on her in 1975 for the Washington Post.
Okay.
So I've already started the research on that as well, because it's remarkable that she would have attained. She was in control at the peak of that position when she was chief of staff. 200, nearly 300 physicians answered to her as a Black woman in the heat of the civil rights movement. She was in such a position of high power and really the linchpin in making sure that those veterans, our capital city of our nation, were receiving the best possible care. And I think there remains a story there to be told about the person that she would become. And I was just amazed at that familial connection, because the women in the family have gone on to do some remarkable things. And having it go all the way to the end of the line really just amazed me. And so that's definitely something that I will be working on to tell that story, because it's definitely a rich story for Dr. Johnson to be told.
Can't wait to read it, because I have been most impressed with your research for the Josephine Leary book. Just amazing. I think you exhausted all sources. So I am sure you will do the same with the next one. Okay. Yeah. And this is for Hilary. Hilary, I know you're writing a second book manuscript about African Americans, how they are remembered and commemorated. The Civil War from 1963 to the present. Could you talk a little bit about that, Hilary?
I will say this as I'm finishing up my last chapter, and I will say, Kiana, you are in the previous chapter when I talk about the role of Black literature in pushing the field and pushing narratives and storytellings of untold histories of the Civil War. Leary built her own monument. She built a building, and that building is what matters, and that legacy matters. So for me, talking about how everyday people, men, women, and children, including the women of my own family, who did extraordinary things but have not getting written about, and how they defied the expectations of the nation to forget what Black men did during the Civil War, the sacrifices of communities of slavery who came out as free people, and those who were the liberators, and those families who were left home in the North, what they did to save the nation, and how the nation then betrayed them for those who, because they were white, that mattered more. So I'm really looking at the types of sources, and which is why I love, it's not just the everyday writings and the letters, it's the photography, it's the poetry, it's the poems, it's the plays, it's the lived ways in which people remembered what the Civil War mattered. And every time I looked at Josephine Leary, I kept on thinking about her daughter and grandchildren, and it's like, yeah, I built that. As they're seeing that same Confederate monument that's around the Edenton and other areas, it's like, that's my monument. What does that look like? And how women are the caretakers of family history, but also this history that I'm looking for. If it wasn't for Black women, I would not be able to do this book. If it wasn't for ordinary people who went beyond the expectations of them, who stepped out and defied what was the norm, I wouldn't be here. So it's great to go from the Civil War and Black women in Northeast and South Central Pennsylvania. And I'm ending right now with my last chapter on the sesquicentennial in Charleston, South Carolina. I am going from one porch of my family in Pennsylvania to the porches of my dad's family in South Carolina, and all the porches in between. And this is where I do share a commonality with Kiana Alexander, and that's Dorothy Redford and what she did for the Hertford Monument and her role as a historian and documenting Black history of the Civil War. Her pieces, her history, her due diligence is why I include the Hertford Monument that Black women put up before the Confederate Monument came up. When I read that in your inspiration, the tweet and that thing, I was like, I have to read more because I knew that scholar. And you did her justice. And I hope this book does her justice too, because she was an inspiration for me. It's these women who are the caretakers and the storytellers, and we need to celebrate them too. Josephine Leary won't be in there other than your novel, but it's women like her that matters.
Well, I cannot wait to read your book, particularly if it includes literature, because that's my area. But I also will give it to my son-in-law, who is an alumnus of Davidson and who majored in history. And I know he loves the Civil War period. So we'll do that. Okay, thank you both so much. Great comments. Okay, and now I will ask Megan and Melissa to read out audience Q&A.
Hi there. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. First up, we have Lisa. She wants to know more about Josephine Leary's daughters as adults. Did they end up carrying on their mother's real estate legacy?
Okay, so I can tell you that Clara and Flory were not particularly interested in real estate, as in the management of it. Both of them would go on to be educated by Evelina Badham at the Badham School. The Badham family is also real. Hannibal, Senior, Junior, Miles, and Evelina, those are all real people. The Badhams were exactly as they were portrayed in the story. Hannibal Badham was a fantastic local architect and carpenter. His wife, Evelina, was an educator who started the Badham School, where Josephine's children were educated. Many of the Badham houses, I believe 14, are still standing in Edenton. I've seen that several of you are saying that you're traveling to Edenton. Do also ask them to show you those Badham houses, including the Wedding Cake House, which is really remarkable to see. A lot of them you won't be able to enter, but you'll be able to view them from the outside. So after they were educated at the Badham School, both Florence and Clara would grow up to go and become students at Shaw University. They were both majors in education and both will become school teachers. As for Clara, she remained most of her life living either in the Edenton area or in the Washington, D.C. area, where Octavius and Missouri migrated in 1893. It should also be noted that when Octavius and Missouri purchased their house in LaDroit Park, the Washington, D.C. neighborhood outside of Howard University, they broke the color barrier there. They were the first Black family to own property in that neighborhood. And then they would be followed by a lot of Black intelligentsia once that barrier was broken. And she lived most of her life between Edenton and DC, traveling back and forth, would have 3 husbands, but only 1 child, Percy Almeria Reeves, who lived until 1996 and was the person with the forethought to save and preserve Josephine's papers and donate them to Duke University in the early 90s. In terms of Florence, she also continued on as a school teacher. She was to marry a Chinese national named Ying Young. And sometime in the early 20th century, she and Ying migrated to China. And after that time, Florence was not heard from again by her family. She did give her share of her mother's property over to her sister Clara. Clara would hold on to most of it after Josephine's death in 1923, except for those properties that were lost for mortgages and things like that to take care of Josephine as she was ill with stomach cancer. And there was no health insurance at the time. Medical care was pay as you go, and she did have to take out mortgages and loans and sell some of her properties in order to take care of herself for her medical bills. And so the only thing that remained really in family hands into the 20th century was the barbershop, at which Percy and one of his friends worked well into the 20th century.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our next question is, Kim notes that their club loved the book and wanted more of Josephine's story. What made you decide to stop her story when you did?
So in doing research about Josephine's life, there was a lot of information available. And as a writer and a history nerd at heart, my my first desire was sort of to say all the things, tell all the things. And my editor was like, whoa, now we got to rein this in somewhere, or we're looking at, something that's going to be as thick as War and Peace. We got to pick a time period. And so we decided that we would focus on a 20-year period of her life, during which most of the major events of her life, marriage, having children, etc., and most of her property transactions would take place. And so that's how we settled on that period, roughly about 20 years, starting around 1871 to 1872 and ending in around 1893 to 1894, just to sort of narrow the scope of the book, which I'm telling you would have been way, way longer if I had covered her entire life. So this was sort of our way of keeping the book within somewhat of a reasonable length, because I could have just run on with it forever.
Monisha asks Dr. Green if you can recommend any novels or nonfiction books that can provide more insight into the historical context of the novel.
One of the things I would say is there's a lot more needs to be done about Northeast North Carolina and the history in general. So there's a couple of authors who have done statewide histories of North Carolina during the Civil War era, including boarding houses, HBCUs, and the like. And I'm thinking about David Silkenet's series of books about marriage, divorce, and debt. So it's just, and real Black families coming in, because I think about her and other business women. The other thing I'm thinking about too is the early classics about John Hope Franklin and the free Black community and some of the work he did after emancipation in North Carolina. But in terms of local history, I can recommend people and places. The Museum of the Albemarle in Elizabeth City, that really does do that history of that area, will give you really good context of both Indigenous history up to the present, but they really do a good job about the Civil War, slavery, the Civil War Reconstruction, to understand the world at which Leary is operating in, the people she would have encountered, what those other Black communities are doing around there, because this area is also one of education. There's a lot of HBCUs in this area and ones that don't exist anymore. It's a vibrant Black community. She's a part of another group of community members in there too. So what does that world look like? And that museum, hands down, is one of the best. And then also I will give a plug for my former place of employment, Elizabeth City State University, who with Melissa Stuckey, Chaz Reed, and others are renovating the Rosenwald School on their campus. They are actively engaged in what the Green Book looked like in Elizabeth City and the region. They're actively engaged what was this later world of what Leary comes in, so the ending years of the novel, and what does this look like? And I think there's more work to come. So David Silkenet's works, John Hope Franklin's classic works, anything by Dorothy Redford, I'm just gonna lie, not gonna lie, anything by her, Somerset Place, but then also the Museum of the Albemarle.
Thank you so much for those additional resources. Gabrielle asks if, Gianna, if you could go into more detail about how Leary got financing, which bankers helped her acquire her properties, etc.
I will also say, in reference to the last question, there's a detailed bibliography in the back of the book. And a lot of the books that I use for research were not necessarily related to Josephine's life, but to issues that were pertinent at the time, like Dixie's Daughters, Wilmington's Lie. Some of the books that you see in the back of the book, those nonfiction titles, will also provide helpful information for those who are looking to know more about the time period. So in terms of this question, I would say that it is, when you look at, I always say, like, look at the confluence between racism, sexism, and greed. When a person comes to you and they have cash in hand, you're less likely to dispute them when they want to make a purchase from you. So a lot of the things that she purchased with cash. How was she getting the cash? Mostly she was getting it from the barbershop. The running of the barbershop generated a healthy profit. There were not any other barbershops that had as many barbers in or near the town of Edenton. So they were getting clients of all races. And so she was putting aside a portion of the proceeds from the barbershop to go towards her purchases. And I know that the character C.W. Ray that's mentioned in the book was also a real person. And there were times that she would mortgage things from him at the time of purchase and make payments, and they would just make a one-to-one agreement. Typically, she didn't involve a bank in the actual transaction. She might deposit the money that she would make from the barbershop to set aside for the purchase to be later made at a bank, but she typically did not involve banks because that was just a middleman, an extra step that would have slowed down the process or perhaps complicated it for her. So she worked mostly in cash. And when she could not provide cash, she would mortgage directly with that person and make an agreement that worked for both of them rather than involve banks. So that gave her a way to sort of circumvent the obstacles she might have faced had she involved bankers at the time who may or may not have even taken her seriously or been willing to serve her because of her race and her gender.
And can I add one other thing? There's another bank that she probably was leery of banks in the beginning with, the Freedom Savings Bank that goes bankrupt, that African Americans, and a large number of them from Northeast North Carolina and Eastern North
And
Carolina,
there's a certain amount of mistrust that goes with that. It's
they
like, oh no,
lose
this is stable.
everything.
Yeah.
And so for her to deal with cash, also knowing what's going on banking wise and the loss of money at that time when she started her early investments makes sense. So this one-on-one deal would have been very common, but also too, land ownership and prices are so depressed because the collapse of the Confederacy collapsed everything. That a lot of African Americans are able to become landowners because the value is so depressed. So it's not as much cash as there. So she's able to save up, use those profits and maximize because the economy and people around it, they couldn't afford to buy it either. But the Freedom Savings Banks collapsed too, probably would have caused that mistrust for her not even go to the bank. And that was a bank designed for African Americans, but that collapse of that bank really caused a lot of distrust amongst African Americans that they go cash, they will do cash for this type of properties because they are not trusting of any banks at this time.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions about Sweetie from Todd and Matthew. They mentioned that in the novel, he is able to pass as white. They're kind of curious about how that worked and how colorism affected African Americans during Reconstruction.
And so my depictions of Sweetie are based on conjecture, as there are no images remaining of Sweetie. Most likely there are photographs taken of him, but they have been destroyed or lost to time. So most of what we know about what Sweetie looked like was drawn on conclusions from the materials left in the archives, which included handwritten letters and things like that, and sort of the oral tradition passed down of what he looked like from people who knew him, like with Percy speaking with Miss Redford when she was doing her research for her booklet, and how he was described. And so a lot of that is my conjecture based on his standing from the things that I could see in the documents, that he may have been probably quadroon or octoroon, so either 1/4 or 1/8 Black. And so that would have affected his ability to move about in society in Edenton as a small town. There would have been possibly clients that would come to the barbershop that would patronize him, but would not allow Octavius or Josephine to touch their hair because they were obviously of darker complexion. Images remain also of Octavius, so we know what he looked like. And he was a darker skinned Black man. So these are sort of the things, the conclusions that I was able to draw based on the limited information that I found about Sweetie. And colorism is something that has lingered, just like those societal expectations about the roles of women. In that even among Black people in conversations on social media and in gathering places, there have been these conversations ongoing about, you know, the light skin versus the dark skin, the paper bag test, who would have been a house slave versus who would have been in the fields, et cetera, et cetera. And this is one of those things that lingers on and causes a lot of unnecessary division between us as a people, and then can feed into ideas about anti-Blackness coming from outside of our race. And so it's one of those things that's really unfortunate that I really wish that people would let go of, because in most cases, it does not matter how fair-skinned or how dark-skinned you are. People are going to judge you based on that, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum. They can identify you as a Black person. That's all it takes. It doesn't matter if you're a light-skinned Black person or a dark-skinned Black person, or if you're in between. The way that you're treated, a lot of times, is not going to be predicated on that. If you look at the people who have been beaten and killed by police, there's a whole spectrum of skin tones, and there are men and women, grown people and children. It doesn't matter. So, it's time to let go of that sense of division over something that's really very surface level, and really, when you get right down to it, isn't even important. So in a time like this, it would have been even more pronounced, as with, him being able to talk to the sheriff about what happened to them in the churchyard, knowing that the sheriff wouldn't listen to anyone else there because they were all obviously Black and therefore, unworthy to be heard. So these sorts of things continue to linger. And I just wanted to sort of bring that up and just sort of touch on it, not too heavy-handed, but I wanted to touch on it because it still lingers today. And I think it's really something we need to address and overcome.
Thank you so much for that insight. Mallory asks if either of you can elaborate on the historical and legal use of the term quadroon.
I know that when I have been reading texts from the time period, that I see the term used a lot, and I know what it means, and that it means a person being a quarter Black, or having basically one Black grandparent and the other 3 grandparents being of another race, usually white. And this has to do with sort of the lack of autonomy that Black women and Black men had over their own bodies, and the sort of tipping off to the slave quarters in the middle of the night that would happen on the parts of both the master and the mistress. A lot of times these relationships were not consensual, as a person who is being property does not have consent to give, as they don't have autonomy or authority over their life or their body. So there is sort of it's almost like a system of categorization to explain how Black a person is that goes beyond the 1 drop rule, being 1 drop of Black blood makes you Black. This brings it down to something even more on an even like smaller level of how far back can you trace your ancestors, how many of them were Black versus how many of them were white. And it was sort of, I never thought of it as like a legal term, and I don't know that it exists in that way. I think it was more something that was social for people who wanted to sort of categorize Black people in ways that relate to colorism and classism, and sort of the idea that the less Black you were, the better you were. So instead of just saying, oh, I'm part Black, you would say, oh, I'm this minuscule percentage of Black, in order to sort of raise your status in other people's eyes. That's sort of the way that I've always looked at it.
And I would add, it really was this anxiety over how do you determine who's Black or not? And you see this character is a social norm as the tragic mulatta. And you think about, you would pass by someone who's so white presenting that you would not know they were Black because of the generations there. And there's some well-known pictures during the Civil War, the white slaves of New Orleans, of Rosa, Charlie. And you look at them, you're like, you would not think they were Black children, but they are. It becomes a legal category during Jim Crow, though, when it starts to really matter who is white, who is Black, and even the erasure of Indigenous people in Virginia with, there's no category of Indigenous categories anymore. It's just Black, it's either white or colored. Mm-hmm. And those legal categories come in the Jim Crow era, where quadroon, quintaroon, and everything else, but it goes back to the anxiety that you can visibly not tell if a person's Black phenotypically because of the practices that were going on in the slave quarters of white men going in there, and the children who are the products of this with consent or without. And so it's this, you start to see these antiquated terms that come out of there now. and it goes back to white anxieties that they won't be able to tell who's Black or not. And there's in literature, they have it there. And then also too, I think about Nella Lawson's book, Passing. People who can pass and understand the what does it mean, the social mobility, political mobility to do so. But the anxieties created by those communities that they leave behind, but also those communities who can't read them. And this is where I think that it's within the context of Jim Crow that really becomes a problem, because now it's a legal category who gets access or not. But at the end of Jim Crow goes back to that more social categories. But right now, with Ancestry.com and blood quantum counting, I'm seeing some of this coming back in again. Like, oh yes, we have this as a point of pride. And I'm like, no, let's talk about why you have this, your family tree. So I think it's some larger discussions that we have not overturned, but it really was a social anxiety. It was step under slavery to one that becomes legal briefly because of Jim Crow and then goes back to social.
Thank you so much. And Connie asks how common female barbers were during this time.
Oh man, they are super common, because think about who's doing hair, women's hair, wig making, hot cones, all those tools of the trade. So men, barbering for men, but also hairdressing for women. Who is taking care of the slave mistress's hair? That's women doing that work. When you go out of slavery, those jobs that Black women can have would be seamstressing and sewing, cooking, but also hair and hair taking and hairdressing. Black men too. One of the most successful positions outside of the skills that we think about, blacksmiths, cooper making, so making the barrels and other stuff, is barbershops, because everyone needs their hair cut. Everyone needs their hair done. And those are the places where you have all clienteles of all races, regardless coming in. Black women would typically deal with more Black clients in a public space, and then privately they will do white women's hair. Black men are barbering for all races. And if you are lighter, you do there, but they tend to do with all clientele, because barbering with the straight razor is a skill. You do not want to get cut. So they trust those who can do that skill. And there's some really great known Black barbers in there, but it's definitely one where you think about barbershop, there's always a woman or two who are doing Black women's hair in the back. And that's just because Black women, we have our vanity even today.
Wonderful. I'll turn it back over to Melissa. I think that was our last audience question, but thank you so much for all that wonderful information and fleshing out that historical context. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you to both Kiana and Hillary for their conversation. It was deeply engaging and deeply informative, and really, I think, helped all of us understand, a little bit more about the novel. And I want to say thank you to Liliana for moderating this evening, as well as to Laura for introducing this evening's program, and to wish our moderator a very happy birthday today.
Thank you.
Happy birthday!
Thank you.
On this day that she shares with Josephine N. Leary. So today is Josephine N. Leary Day. We'll give a special shout out to the Edenton Historical Commission, who I know Kiana has worked with and had her book there last year in honor of Josephine N. Leary. So we get to celebrate the woman today, as well as Liliana on her birthday. So thank you to our wonderful audience for attending and for asking questions. Sorry we could not get to them all. They were really great. We appreciate everyone's time and engagement. And after the conclusion of this event, those of you who registered with an email address will receive a brief survey to complete. We greatly appreciate you completing this survey to hear your feedback on the program. We also encourage you to visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about our other upcoming events in the North Carolina Reads series, and to subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date with all NC Humanities news and programs. So we'll pop that in the chat. I think Kiana has also put her website in there, so go give her website a visit to see what she's up to and her upcoming books that we're all very much looking forward to. So I want to thank everyone again for attending, and have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.